Welcome, everybody. I'm Sarah Hansen, Executive Director of the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society. And as I was saying, this is What's in a Name is a series that we started a few years ago, actually, inspired by Dan Jones, our creative director, who loves maps for starters. So that's why you'll see lots and lots of maps as we go through. Well, we both love maps. But then obviously this program lends itself to maps, which is part of why we love them. But we've done a few different sections around the lake. The White Bear Lake Area Historical Society represents the 5 municipalities that touch the water, so Birchwood, Delwood, Matamidi, White Bear Lake, and White Bear Township. And we're working our way sort of around, not necessarily in any specific order, but went for some of the basic, kind of the downtown, the low-hanging fruit for the first one, and then made our way out a bit. And what we realized is that part 4, we focused on bald eagle-ish, and there's a lot of White Bear Township, and you'll understand this a little bit more in a minute when we get into the maps, but there's a lot of White Bear Township that's sort of by bald eagle, but not bald eagle proper, or not. It's a little bit complicated. And White Bear Beach, of course, is part of that kind of fringe of bald eagle, or right next to bald eagle. And then there are some little pockets of the township in particular, and we'll talk a little bit about the city as well. But there are little pockets of the township in particular that aren't really bald eagle or the beach or Bel Air, and for some reason there's a lot of bees in the township. But anyway, we'll go ahead and jump in a little bit. I do want to say thank you to the Ramsey County Library System and acknowledge the fact that funding for programs like this are in part supported through the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. So the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund is what allows the library to have us in to present programs like this. So as I said, this is a 2022 map. We're going to kind of cover a little bit of everything from the county line up above at the top there, sort of down and around through a little bit of White Bear Beach, down around through Bald Eagle, and then over into little fringes of North Oaks, I guess, and then back kind of up and out again. And well, you'll see. It's the best way to put it. Part 4 we won't talk a lot about Benson Airport, but I will say that the airport itself and the park, the open area, green space that is across the highway from Benson Airport there on the north end of the what is today White Bear Township, were all part of the Benson family farm. Part 4, segment 4, has that information in more depth, so I won't spend a lot of time on that, but we can certainly talk about it at the end if you're interested. And then the same thing with Solheim and Hobie Lane, talking about the Solheim or the Hobie family who lived in the house there called Solheim, that on West Bald Eagle Boulevard, that was the Norwegian consulate for a number of years as well. Again, that's covered pretty thoroughly in part 4, but we'll go ahead and jump ahead a little bit. So Joseph Nicolet, or Nicolet, if you want to go with the French pronunciation, was the first to record anything about our area. And we use this map, or this excerpt from his map, in a lot of our programs because it gives us kind of that first grounding of things. But what you can see is Bears Lake up there, not too far from the 1843. That's the first recorded instance of White Bear Lake. And it's interesting because we know that Nicolet, or Nicolet himself, was guided. He had Native American guides taking him through the upper Mississippi Valley. So if you can imagine, and by that they mean huge, massive, not just the little valley. And so he added places essentially that were significant and specifically called out by the Native guides. And so the fact that we are on this map is significant in that sense. And so I always like to kind of pause and recognize that this area was definitely heavily used as a migratory area, part of their migratory space, particularly for the Dakota. We are also kind of on the transition line between the Ojibwe and the Dakota. So it's kind of an interesting piece. So that we come from our first map, which of course you probably couldn't get a whole lot of detailed information other than the fact that it's cool that we're on there. So now you see 1848. They are getting ready to form the territory of Minnesota, And this is the actual original survey of the space we're talking about from 1848. This in itself, again, doesn't give a ton of information other than sort of shapes and sizes of the island, for example, and other things. But it does, the surveyor's notes go along with this. They kept little notebooks. And what this tells us in a lot of cases is really about a little bit of the wildlife, but a lot about the plant life. So what trees were here, what sort of land it was, what sort of soil it was, all of that. So it's kind of interesting to see. If we continue on, now you can see that people are starting to own the land. It's been made available through the land surveys, and that development, if you will, is starting to pop up by 1867, just a little bit. Note that the island, we're going to end with Bald Eagle Island at the end of the program. So note that the island here in 1867 is labeled as Smith's Island. It has had many, many names. So, and in fact, I think there it says White Oak. Yeah, White Oak Island. So always interesting. The other thing that I like to point out on these particular maps, this is 1886, the town of Bald Eagle was actually platted a few different ways and a few different times in the different maps. Never totally developed or incorporated as a town, or created as a, incorporated is the wrong word, but never fully formed into a town, I guess is the best way to say it. 1887, again, things are picking up. Again, land is being divided, and the people are coming. You can see all the different resources we have. This is the 1920. This is where Dan gets really excited because it's got lots of tiny information on it. So a little bit tougher to read, but lots of tiny information. So those are the maps essentially that we use to sort of go through and be able to piece this together, along with census data, family trees, official government records, whether they be township or city or village minutes from their meetings, forming roads, the county's data as far as road dedications and road orders, and you'll see some of those, and all kinds of other things. But before we go fully into it, because you're going to see a little bit of both in these, but can anyone tell me how you know if you are in the township or the city of White Bear Lake? I know you. Yeah, go ahead. Uh-huh. So the city and the township, their boundaries flip back and forth significantly, and they will throughout this program as well. So it's if the street name signs are brown, you are in the township. If they are green, you are in the city. So just keep that in mind. This program, probably more than any other, it does that. So as I mentioned, with the top, the other thing that, to give you a good solid orientation, the top of all of the maps will be north. So as you're looking at anything, should be north. I didn't change any of them, did I? Okay. I have a tendency to not worry about details like that, in that sense anyway. But so the top of everything will be north. And again, this is the area we're looking at. So the County Road J, or the county line on the top, would be basically the top of this particular map, keeping us in Ramsey County as we go. So, all right, we're going to start with something really easy. We have Short Street, and I bet you can tell me why it's named Short Street. What I find thoroughly entertaining, and that's exactly why it's named Short Street, literally because it is short, but what I find entertaining about that is that there's another short street in the township, almost directly to the west of it. So it always makes me laugh a little bit that and the township in particular has that a lot. You'll find there are a lot of the same name streets, there are multiple fourths and fifths and thirds and different things depending on where you are, and some other quirky pieces. So we'll play with that. Some other examples of names that are a little bit more modern and names we know of, sort of where they came from, are Santerra Circle and Santerra Park. Interestingly, this is on the north end of Portland before you would leave the county. So if you are on Portland Avenue heading north, it's not far from where you would cut out into Anoka or Washington up there. But Santerra, it was something that was created not that long ago, in the 1980s actually, when the Sand family, Dick Sand was a longtime town board chair or town board supervisor. When the Sand family, their land was acquired for Tamarack Nature Center, the big nature center, and that's where their house was. Some of their land, not or some of the nature center, not all of it, but that's where their house was. So they moved their house, bought some land on this edge of the township, moved their house, and were able to name the streets and the park. So they chose Santerre for the names. That is an easy story because we know what was going on. Then we come into some of these kind of stories where this is Bloom Road, also up in that vicinity. And we know, now of course, there's also a Bloom Avenue in the city of White Bear Lake over by the Central and the Hippodrome. Interestingly, Bloom Avenue, I'll flip back to this, but Bloom Avenue, which you see here, is highlighted there. This is also Bloom Avenue, the same street, same segment of the street. You'll notice that during this time period, it was named White Bear Avenue, and that was the original name of that street. We know that the Bloom in the city, over by the schools, was named Bloom after Fred Bloom, who was mayor. Let me just make sure I know which one he is. He is on the back on the right there, standing on the right. That was Fred Bloom, who was mayor of White Bear early on in the 1930s, 1940s. We know for sure that that was named for him. We don't know why Bloom Road was named Bloom Road. It could very well be that it's about flowers blooming and you know, I mean, there's a whole lot of nature words in the township, a whole lot of trees and animals and things, Bambi and other things that sort of allude to that. So it could very well be that. But if I had to bet, I would say that it's probably ties back. We also like a lot of tradition in our community. So I'd have to guess that it ties back. The gentleman sitting in front of Fred there is a gentleman named Casper Bloom, who was a Civil War hero from our area, or ended up settling in our area. He was from Wisconsin initially, but ended up coming back to our area. And then there was Robert Bloom, another relative of theirs who's not in the photo, who had a department store just down the street here from us, where up until recently Catronio's Liquor was, and all of that. As you turn down 3rd Street, there was a Bloom's department store. So it could have been named for a lot of different folks, but that is one we've not been able to nail down quite. And I'll tell you, and Ellen, I might lean on you for this. Do you know? Oh, I was okay. Sorry, yes. So the reason I say that, okay, so we do know this development, with the exception of the Morgan Trail piece, which I think might be separate, but clearly, typically when names like this pop up on a plat, it's a family. It's the family of the developer, the family of the people who sold the land to be developed, whatever. I wasn't able to track this one down as far as that goes, but I did laugh because, and I'm calling out on Ellen. So Ellen is a good friend of my sister, my older sister's, and one of their group of friends' family actually platted this. So Connie's family, Georgia did. So I'm trying to figure it out, but we couldn't connect any of the names to that, specifically to that family, as we played along. What I do find fascinating, though, is that Franklin Avenue was there. It's been there for a long time, actually, in a number of iterations, and the plat is called Franklin Heights. So there's something going on there that we need to dig a little bit deeper into, but kind of a fun piece. You can't see it in this one. Let's see. The other thing, so here's where you see, it's zoomed in a bit, but where you see that's the same Franklin Avenue. It's continuing on up, and you see Fremont and Vernon. Those streets are long gone. And that happens a lot, where when the initial plat, they'll lay out different streets and name them things, and then all of a sudden, 20 years later, you see a map and they're not necessarily the same configuration, like you see here, or the same names, even close to the same names. So that's an area we get to keep digging, and that's always kind of fun with what we get to do. So as we continue in that vicinity, one of the things that always cracks me up, and I love to give the township a little bit of grief on this, is that their park names are sometimes really descriptive or sometimes really sort of general. And this one I laughed because when I was talking with them, I said, so glider park, please tell me it's not, because like there's a glider in the playground or something. And there's not. or it's not, but it wasn't a whole lot more creative than that. It actually was named Glider Park because it was within the vicinity of Benson Airport. And at the time the park was dedicated, the airport had the glider club. They would fly gliders in and out of there. They've since moved away from the airport, but kind of an interesting piece when you look at it. So, and then again, the creativity part. So the plat, the original plat or the early plat for White Bear Beach area is known as Garden Place, the Garden Place plat. And there's a creek running through. So I'm pretty sure that's how they got Garden Creek Park. So some of them are, like I say, very obvious, very simple. And then others, as we go on, you'll find are a little more complicated. Bartilla Court, if anybody is from that vicinity. Again, this is Portland. This would be Portland running north-south here. So White Bear Lake is down here, Bald Eagle Lake over here. Bartilla is one of the little streets or smaller developments that juts off to the east there. The Bartilla family owned that property in the 1960s and for a number of years, and presumably are the ones who sold it to be platted. So not, again, not super shocking. And of course, the obvious East County line, which you see on the far, far right side there. That is exactly what it sounds like before you hop into Washington County. And one of my favorites, Northwest, that runs northwest. It's actually really nice when they keep them simple like that. Like I said, we'll get into a few more that are a little more complex. One of the intriguing things, there are a number of streets that continue in any community, not just in this particular set, but a number of streets that continue and don't continue the naming entity, if that's what you want to call it. So, for example, Buffalo, which is an easy animal name, I don't think it has any particular other significance than that. But Buffalo, if you were to continue it on, essentially becomes County Road H2. And so the fact that they didn't keep that name consistent across is always a little bit interesting, but they didn't. And you see clearly H2 over on the west side of the lake there. And then there are all of the Hugo Road, Stillwater Road, Centerville Road, all of those that are kind of fun. But here we get into an interesting one that if you've ever taken our gangster tour, our gangster bus tour, it's entertaining in many ways. But one of the areas we go to so this is Bald Eagle Lake over here, East Bald Eagle Boulevard. And when if you're going up the east side of Bald Eagle Lake, you'll come to a point where the road turns. You can't go north any further. And so you turn, and that's onto Taylor. Right at that intersection, if you will, or at that curve, basically, your turn, is a cottage called Idlewild. And it is it's a cute cottage. It's a cottage that's been there for probably 100 years now, but it is the notorious spot where Ma Barker and the Karpus gang, the Barker Karpus gang, hung out and planned the Hams kidnapping in May of 1933. So we do a drive-by on the bus with the gangster bus tour, and I always love it because Taylor's fine. Taylor's probably a railroad associated name, quite honestly, although we do know that there were many Taylors, as you can imagine, in town. It's not a super uncommon name, so it could be named for lots of different things, but there was a Taylor involved with the railroad, and a lot of the railroad executives got names on different things. But what's interesting about Taylor here is that you see what we were just looking at is a little piece up there, and it continues, and it still does this today. It continues across the highway and out to Portland, where it dead ends, essentially. What I think is fascinating is we've got Gaston or Gaston down here, and it at one time also continued across the way. It doesn't anymore. It disappears. So again, kind of an unusual thing to have those pop out of there. As we were playing around with this, we've always wondered, so the gangster thing, we've always wondered, the name of this plat is Shady Side, okay? It's a Shady Side addition to White Bear Township. I mean, come on. It's got names like Hoxie, which, the Hollyhocks Club in St. Paul was the gangster hangout. O'Connor was the name of the police chief in St. Paul. It was the O'Connor system that allowed all the gangsters to come and go. So it just makes you wonder, and we kind of like to play that up a little bit. Unfortunately, the historian in me can't let that totally fly, because this was all platted with these names in 1886, long before the gangster era of the 1930s. So they, as much as it seems perfect that they were there, that is sadly not probably the case. Now, we don't know for sure, but Gaston or Gaston is a more unique name anyway. And we know that there was a Gaston and William, actually, so it could be the Williams and the Gaston piece, but who owned a chunk of land down in the south end of town, very south end of town, south of White Bear Lake itself. And so it's very possible that they were somehow involved in platting or in anything to do with the land. But could be. It wouldn't surprise me. I couldn't find that, but it wouldn't surprise me. And there was no Gaston in any of the census data or anything else that I was going through. So he owned land, but we didn't know otherwise. This is another one that makes me laugh a bit. So you can see it originally platted Gilbert. This is, again, Taylor's, the one that sort of swoops. It's cut off by the street sign picture, but Taylor swoops through there. Gilbert is supposed to run north-south right through there. It certainly doesn't. But they kept it. They just flipped it around and stuck it over here a little bit north of Taylor instead. It right. It's oh funny.
I had to Photoshop your street sign. You don't even have a street sign.
Did you actually make that?
Yeah.
Are you serious?
Because they don't have a street sign. Right.
So we don't make things up, remember? Yeah, no, that makes sense. But yeah, so it's an interesting, I don't know what happened to the original one, but clearly they didn't. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh, never went all the way. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, it's a strange world. Again, you can see Birch Lake here, so a little bit removed from that neighborhood, but there is an O'Connor owning property on Birch Lake, so it could very well tie those pieces back in, but sadly, they didn't have to say why they were naming things a certain way, which I really wish they did. Make my life a lot easier in many ways, or answer a lot of those crazy questions, but oh well. So if many of our programs talk about the railroad, and I won't go into the railroads other than to say that Bald Eagle was a very significant spot for railroads in the sense that the Sioux line, it is where the junction of the Sioux line going east and west, which is still running, and the Burlington Northern, all the different variations of the Northern Pacific and whatnot, and of course began as the Lake Superior, Mississippi, going north and south. So that junction was a big deal, if you can imagine. And at that junction was a very large very large depot and tower. You can see the station tower there. The interestingly, after the railroad era sort of faded away and they were moving depots like crazy around in the 1930s or so, the Bald Eagle Depot building remained for many years as the community club, the Bald Eagle Community Club. And so folks around the area who grew up around the area and whatever can remember, Halloween parties and card parties and potlucks and, all the things at the community club.
Is that just west of 61?
It is, and it is. In fact, yes, I would say it's kind of tough to see, but so Four Seasons Park is where it is today. It actually, interestingly, Park Avenue, which was not named for that because, of course, that was the depot at that end, but there was a park, Eagle Park, down at this end, which you'll see a little closer in a second. But today, in theory, it would have connected Eagle Park to Four Seasons Park if they had existed at the same time and place. So Park Avenue was a logical name. They just didn't really know it. I don't think they did it on purpose exactly, but it, I suppose Eagle Park works. The Four Seasons Park, you can kind of see it better on this one. You can see the Bald Eagle Junction down there, and essentially Four Seasons Park is a really large park. It goes there a playground and picnicky kind of area up here, and then a baseball field space or softball field down that way, closer to the highway. And the whole really span is park today, interestingly. Now, Eagle Park, not so much. The Eagle Park area was developed into Spring Park Villa, which was a resort on Bald Eagle Lake from about 1905 until 1975 or so. I mean, it lasted into the 70s. It was, so there are definitely folks around who certainly remember it being there. It was known pretty much locally as the Villa. And it's separate. We talk a lot about the resort era in White Bear history, which was a very big deal on White Bear Lake and Bald Eagle to a certain extent too. But the Villa is sort of a separate story. It came later. It came as the rest of the resorts were dying off, as things were changing. By about 1910, the other resorts were pretty well faded out or on their way out. And so Spring Park Villa really took sort of that next step. And Bald Eagle was kind of the last, I don't want to say holdout, but the tradition of a summer cottage or summer cabin at the lake remained at Bald Eagle longer than it did on White Bear. That faded away pretty quickly by the 20s and 30s on White Bear Lake, but Bald Eagle maintained it. In fact, I think there are still a couple out there that people use that way. So it's kind of interesting. But Spring Park Villa had the main house, and then it had little cottages dotted around. And it was named because there was a natural spring along the lakeshore, a water spring for natural pure water, and the park. So they were able to come up with that. They had often the cottages, or not the cottages, but the resorts had these pavilions on the lakeshore, much like this one at Spring Park Villa, where you could sit in a screen porch or sit, sometimes they were screened, sometimes they weren't, but you could sit and enjoy the lake breezes and all of that, enjoy the water. You could also, depending on the size, often they would have orchestras come or bands come and play music so that you can dance in the evenings and all of that. So this is another one that's very creatively named. Stillwater Street, although of course it doesn't get you directly to Stillwater. In fact, it's kind of a crooked, jaggedy sort of route, if you will, all the way through, but you can get there eventually if you keep going. But it does have that directional piece to it. So as you continue along Stillwater Street, if you're on Stillwater Street, one of the streets I always remember from being a kid, and just because I thought it was an interesting name, and I don't know why, but seeing it driving down Stillwater Street as a kid, was Lotta Street. And I never knew what does that mean? Where did that come from? And interestingly, we were going through some other things a while back and came across this obituary for Marion Lotta. She died in Minneapolis, so she wasn't here when she died, but she wasn't born here. She was actually born in Clinton, Wisconsin, or grew up in Clinton, Wisconsin, got married in Clinton, Wisconsin. Her 3 daughters were born in Wisconsin. Her husband died fairly early on, and as the years go on in the 1930 census, the late 20s, she's living in Minneapolis with her 3 daughters, and they're students at the University of Minnesota. I think her husband died in 25. And then in 1930, she sort of, I can't quite pinpoint where she's at, but her daughters are now working in a mansion in Minneapolis as servants in a mansion on Pillsbury Street in Minneapolis. So, not sure what's going on. And then, what I love about this is the tiny little hint here, about midway through the paragraph, it's talking about her daughters, and it says, Mrs. Wayne Jean Slocum of White Bear. Well, Slocums, we can connect, because Slocums actually owned this property, this farm, had a nice big farm there. So where Highway 96, which is also known as County Road G legally, and South Birch Lake Boulevard, this is essentially where Health Partners is today on Highway 96. That whole chunk of land was the Slocum farm. And here you see Wayne Slocum and actually Jean, his wife. No, I don't think she was his wife then, but at the University of Minnesota, he was a well-known track star at the University of Minnesota. So you can see the 2 of them there. So you just never quite know what resource it's going to take to sort of string the story together. Yes, exactly. We were having that discussion in the office with all the reconfiguring over there, if it's still Slocum Field if it still exists, that because where Slocum Field used to be, the football field at North is parking lot now. So did they move the name to the other field or not? That I don't know.
They turned the field north and south.
Well, they turned Price Field from Central North, yeah. So it's one of those where it's like, wait a minute, and then there was Larica's Field down with the soccer folks on the north. So I don't know. I have to go check out. I'm not sure that they've officially named them or transferred all of those exactly, but yes, Slocum was well known, and it's really for the track more so than the football field itself. But anyway, so Bald Eagle itself is kind of a, I always love the West Bald Eagle Boulevard, East Bald Eagle Boulevard, Bald Eagle Avenue. All of it is fairly logical, thank God, but interesting nonetheless as you split. And it's exactly what you think. A little bit tough to see in that map, but it hits the lake. Bald Eagle Avenue goes to the lake, hits the lake, and then splits east and west. So you can kind of figure that out. I won't spend a lot of time on these. They're kind of exactly what you'd expect. LaValle Court. There was the LaValle family owned a chunk of land, as did the Petersons, the Andersons, the Parkers, the Milners. You know, they're all what you'd think they would be. And then sometimes named after the, actually, I'm going to point this one out. Sometimes named after the kids as well as it carries out. But you can see Hammond here, and you'll see it highlighted in a second. But you'll see Hammond here. These are one of my favorite resources that we have, the road records. So these come out of the county, and it's literally the order to put in the road, to open the road. So if you look at this, this is 1889. But what I love is that it's supposed to be named, the only thing we can have ever been able to figure out, because it's right there, is supposed to be named for the Hammond family, no D. But it somehow got named Hammond Road, and we see that all the time where there are typos or whatever on streets, street signs even, and they just get adopted the way they are. So that falls into place. This one was done in 1889, and and you can see the Hammond on the plat maps here more than once. It's definitely Hammon. But if you're not familiar with Hammond Road, because it is a fairly short, I mean, it's not as short as Short Street, but it's not incredibly long or noticeable unless you're headed to the town offices or the township complex. So if you are going to Public Works or the township office itself, or Polar Lakes Park, where they've got the baseball fields and the soccer fields, and Polar Lakes Park, everyone asks why it's named Polar Lakes Park, and it's primarily, well, not primarily, it is absolutely because they couldn't come up with anything else that made sense, because they wanted it to be White Bear Park or White Bear Lakes Park, but that sounded funny in White Bear Township and all of that, so they went with Polar instead when they opened the park in about 2000 or 2001. So kind of interesting. Our favorite spot within the park is the White Bear Town Hall, of course, which is at the west end, kind of on the edge of the freeway there as you go toward the west before you would cross over 35. But if you were to leap across from the town hall, this is another kind of fun story. So if you come across 35 and you're over by Cub Foods and all of that, right behind Cub Foods and Applebee's and all of that off of 96 is Allendale Drive. Not a big street, but certainly there, certainly recognizable. Well, Allendale Drive actually stems from the Allendale Farm, which the Stoddard family, and you'll see at the end, at the north end there of Allendale Drive, it goes into Stoddard Lane. And you'll see, so this is the Allendale farmhouse, the Stoddard family's farmhouse. It's spelled three different ways on different pictures, so we can't blame you for that. I won't blame you this time. But so James Stoddard, the grandfather, great grandfather of the family that's around today. James Stoddard worked for James J. Hill, so the North Oaks farm, what it was eventually the North Oaks farm, or eventually became North Oaks. James Stoddard worked for him at the North Oaks farm, and then later worked for his son Louis when Louis took over the farm and the city of North Oaks was formed. And then his sons, Alan and James, not Junior, but another James, took over from there and wanted to, why is it misbehaving? Wanted to start a dairy farm. So they essentially purchased adjoining land and began farming in their entity. So Alan and James, the son, had the dairy farm, named after Alan. I don't know why only Alan, but it was. And then ultimately, James Stoddard, the third James Stoddard, all had different middle names, so they're not juniors, seniors, whatever. But the third James Stoddard ended up farming the land. Essentially, Alan had passed away. You can see, like I said, Stoddard Circle and Stoddard Lane. So all of that was their farmland. Alan had passed away, and James the third in line was off in the Navy, had been in the Navy for a number of years, and was actually planning to stay in the Navy, become a lifelong sailor, and was called home because his uncle Alan had passed away and his dad needed help on the farm. And so they ended up finishing it out. Interestingly, I think he was, that's youngest James, if you will. He was kind of a natural from the looks of it out on the farm. So it sounds like it was a good solution for all of them. The family lived and worked on the farm until the 1980s when they sold it, and of course the development has happened all around it. But the names carry on. You can see the Allendale Dairy. Right, exactly. I know. It's like, okay, they're everywhere. It's just, and different. That one's different than, it's got the 2 L's on the truck. So I don't know. It happens, and you wonder why the street signs get funky. It happens a lot. So Moon Lake Park, Moon Lake Circle, and Moon Lake are all named after the lake. It's fascinating to me. This is one of those things because Moon Lake, as you see, it's the pond or lake that's right up there in the middle of the park. It doesn't look like you'd expect it to be sort of crescent shaped or something. From all the maps we've seen, it wasn't. So I don't know why they call it that. The circle part makes sense because it's literally a circle as you drive in there and go around, but not sure where the Moon Lake part came from to begin with. And then as you jump just a little bit to the southwest, so the railroad tracks are technically the boundary between North Oaks and the township. This little chunk of the township is the area behind Cub. So Cub Foods and all of that is still in White Bear Township today. So there's a kind of a strange little triangle area that is township between North Oaks and the city of White Bear Lake. Interestingly, when they developed their townhomes, there's the big church and funeral home here, and then there are townhomes, Weston Woods and the Gilfillan townhomes throughout this area. When they developed all of that, they took the name Gilfillan Lane, and there's actually a Gilfillan Court that pops up over here. Well, those are newer, relatively newer, but they took the name from Gilfillan Road in North Oaks, and there's a couple pretty significant reasons for that. That one got selected that way. So Charles Gilfillan, who you see here, was born in New Hartford, New York in 1831 to Scottish immigrant parents James and Janet. He moved to Stillwater in 1851 and then to St. Paul in 1855. So by the time he was 25 or so, he was well entrenched in Minnesota. He was an attorney who ran for St. Paul mayor in 1860. And I have to throw this in there, Dan. I had to chuckle because my great-great-grandfather ran for mayor in 1860 and apparently beat Gilfillan. I was like, wait a minute, I know that date. So interesting. Now, my great-great-grandfather unsuccessfully went on to run for state legislature. Gilfillan creamed him in that. I don't think they actually ran against each other in that, but he did continue on because Gilfillan served in the House of Representatives from 1864 to 1866, so as the Civil War was ending, and as a state senator from 1866 to 1876. So he had a long public service career, essentially. But regardless of all of that specifically, He's most notably remembered because he was instrumental in the planning and construction. It was his forethought and process that created the St. Paul water system, the St. Paul Water Works. So the water, if you're in Shoreview or the North Oaks kind of area, there's still land. You'll see big signs that say, St. Paul Water System or St. Paul property of the St. Paul Water Works. It was Gilfillan who actually bought up much of that land, and he. Let me see if I can. And you're the water guy, so I might need you to back me up on that or help me point things out if I get too crazy. But he bought up most of the land to secure the water rights from the sources as the water headed south towards St. Paul. So you can see from Pleasant Lake on down, and it continues on. I think through Phelan. Is it Badness? Dennis first, and okay. So interestingly, he had bought most of what would become North Oaks Farm and become North Oaks. Essentially, he had bought up the land to make sure that those water rights were protected. When it actually began, when it was sold, he and his brother, who had a little bit of a share in it, but when he sold it in 1882 to St. Paul, the city paid $37,000 in cash and $313,000 in bonds to assume the property and make sure that they had the water rights. Now, that didn't mean that they owned all of the land. They just got some of the land, and then the flowage rights. Included, specifically, it says, included in the purchase were certain rights of flowage and drainage upon the private lands of C.D. Gilfillan in White Bear and Mounds View towns. And like I say, essentially, that's the land. Most of the land is what became James J. Hill's farm, but the water rights were retained by the city. They would have, without that, up to that point, there were huge water challenges, and without that, St. Paul would have been in tremendous trouble all the way through. Yeah.
So it's interesting, like Ox Lake over by Moon Lake.
Okay.
It still has that name. Is this the 1867 map?
Uh-huh.
And that, look at what Gilfillan Lake's name is now, or it was.
Duck.
So obviously.
Well, he didn't know. He wasn't on the scene at all by then. Yeah, that makes sense. And of course, the one that people always key into from this map is Lambert's Lake, which Lambert, and you can see Alexander Ramsey's actually showing up as a property owner up here. They were certainly all kind of buying up. They were contemporaries buying up pieces. But Lambert's Lake is completely dry. It's just a creek, essentially. I mean, mostly marshland. I mean, it's no lake. It's not. We're not. Yeah. So those things certainly change as well. But so this one's one of my favorites. Shush. Because I actually got to suggest this name. So this is a development that was going in. You can see Monarch Highway is 35E heading north, Centerville Road here, County Road H2. So just north of H2, there was a small little development going in a few years ago. And they were trying to, it's on the edge of North Oaks, and they were trying to come up with a name that had a historical connection. And yet, Hill Farm, all those things have been used 1,000 times. And so they reached out to the Historical Society, and I was excited after a while. It took a little while, I'm not going to lie. But I was excited after a while to come up with Mohegan. So it's Mohegan Lane, and there's a Mohegan Court that jumps off of it that they named. And those are named for Mary Hill, James J. Hill's wife, Mary, because her maiden name was Mohegan. And she actually, to be perfectly frank, in everything that I've ever read or seen or learned about the Hill family, it was Mary who loved coming out to the farm. It wasn't, James was in the office and doing his things in St. Paul and whatever. And he spent time out there for sure, but it was a business entity for him. For her, it was an escape with the kids to the farm and to the lake and all the things. So she's not as heavily represented out there. So I thought that was kind of fun to be able to be a part of that. So we'll go ahead and continue our way back a little bit along 96, kind of. So again, we're coming from Cub and Applebee's and whatever, and heading east back Meadowlands across across 35E, and you'll encounter White Bear Parkway and Township Parkway. Again, not super creative. Not nothing too wild and crazy, but worth, I guess, mentioning. And then one of my favorite stories is Bebo Road, and mainly because I like the ones that have fun people. You can research the people, you can connect the families to it. You also have documents that help you do that. So this one is one of those. So White Bear Parkway runs both to the north of 96 and to the south of 96. This part would be to the south of 96. So if you're familiar at all with the White Bear Lake Sports Center for the hockey games and ice skating lessons and things, that would be just up off the screen basically. But if you continue down White Bear Parkway down, you'd encounter Bebo Road. And it's a fairly quiet residential little area. But the Bebo family themselves owned land there for, well, as early as, I want to say, I don't have it written in here, but they had at least 40 acres, we know, as early as 1890 or so. And this is 1902. This is better than the Hammond Road record order. This one for Bebo Road, because it names the petitioners. You have to get so many portion of the adjoining residents to petition the township or the county to open these roads. And I love that this one names them. So you see names like Belland, Capistrant, Peltier. Can't read Bessel, I'm not sure. Elmer, Wiggins, Becker, Kiefer, lots of Kiefers. Charles Bebo, Vincent Rapp, another Belland. 14 legal voters residing within 3 miles of the cartway hereinafter described. So what I love about this is it gives the legal descriptions and all of that. So you can take the road order from 1902 and follow it with the maps. These are maps of that particular area. They actually, if we were to put them together and really splice them in, they'd be flip-flopped. But the cartway, it's literally, you can't make it out in the blown up version, but it's literally referred to as a cartway on the map. I mean, it's actually called out as that on both sections of the map. And that is precisely where that road is today and goes across. So in 1902, Charles Bebo is on the petition wanting this land, or wanting this road opened. So you can see Charles Bebo on the left there, literally in the fur coat, long fur coat, with his wife Emily. As you can imagine, Charles is a French-Canadian immigrant to the White Bear area. He actually came to what would be Vadnais now initially, and then, like I say, by 1890, 1900, they had the 40 acres here. And then let me see, I think this is interesting. He met here in Minnesota. He met and married his wife, whose name was Jane Ann, but they called her Emily, so don't ask. I don't know why. But her last name was Cluett, and they met and married in 1863. Now, the Cluett family has huge history in the area, so it was one of those that made me go, oh. They had a lot to do with law enforcement in farming initially, from Centerville and Hugo on down through Vadnais, White Bear Township through Vadnais. And one of the Cluetts was actually the overseer of the removal of the large Native American Indian mound at Lake Avenue and Shady Lane. So I believe that was her brother. So it's one of those where I'm like, oh, let's see what we can play with here. And then from there, they had, let me see, they had so then they had their son Charles, who you see on the other side, the right side there, who, along with his wife Agnes, ended up owning the 40 acres that are along Bebo Road, or were along Bebo Road. Of course, it's all developed today, but kind of fun to be able to trace that through. Now, if you jump across to the other side of the highway, the other side of 96, sorry, you'll see Hedman Way. And Hedman Way is one that a lot of folks think, and to my knowledge, this is not the case, but a lot of folks think that there was a gentleman named Hermit Hedman who was sheriff of Ramsey County for many, many years. to my understanding, there's no connection between that Headman and Headman Way, but I could be very much wrong. I couldn't find a connection anyway. But what's interesting about this one is that it was actually the farm of, I love how they do this with the names, but the third gentleman, the one with the flower on his lapel, is Daniel Hedman. His birth name is actually Olaf Hedman or Olaf Hedman, but he went by, his middle name was Daniel and he went by that. But the property here was platted by Olaf and his wife Hulda in 1941. They were Swedish immigrants who had come to the US. Olaf came in 1905 and Hulda in 1909. And then right after they'd gotten married, he actually went back and they got married in Sweden and then came across in 1909. And they settled up in Roseau. They settled up in northern Minnesota. And by 1930, they show up along Birch Lake. So Hedman Way sort of backs up to Birch Lake, if you will, or connects into Birch Lake between 96 and the lake itself. And interestingly, the property in the census, the property is designated as a farm. They live on, it's stated that they live on a farm. But Olaf is a carpenter and a house builder. So it's kind of interesting. They platted it out, like I said, in 1941, so early, really, for a lot of that. I mean, a lot of that stuff wasn't platted until much later. And Hulda lived there until she passed away in 1962. So kind of interesting. I will note that when it was on the original plat, it was actually Hedman Avenue, and it was just the east-west stretch. The side roads, which is all just sort of a loop now called Hedman Way, the side roads were English, which of course is continued on in Maplewood and further to the south, and I'm not positive they line up, but kind of interesting. And then Clarence, which I thought was very bizarre because there's a Clarence Street that runs the opposite direction down Invermere Park for closer to Highway 61, but not at all in alignment in any way with this. So I don't know what they were trying to do there exactly, but kind of interesting. So if we take 96 and take a left onto Otter Lake Road and continue our way on up, we will, of course, hit Tamarack Nature Center, which is named for the tamarack bogs that were all around. And if you'll recall, it was Tamarack, it was part of the property at Tamarack where the Sand family house, as I said, came from and was moved. You can see Otter Lake, lots of otter named things, the school, the road, the lake itself. There clearly must have been a fair number of otters in the vicinity at some point, I would imagine. Otter View Trail, lots of things pulling from that. And then the last one, or one of the last ones, I guess, not quite the last, but one of the last family names, if you will, is Brandlewood Court. And Brandlewood Court is this development just before you get up into Anoka County, just before you hit the northern edge of the township. And again, Highway 30 or 35E is over here running on the left side of the screen. And Otter Lake would be basically over to your right. Brandlewood Court is actually, or Brandlewood, this whole development, is actually on the site of the Brandlewood, or the Brandle Farm, I'm sorry, which was a functioning farm up until I think the early 80s when they developed, late 70s, early 80s when they platted it out and developed it. Let me see. So, and then if we go back by Otter Lake School and take H2, which is kind of interesting in its own right, why there's an H2 versus an H or all of that. It's the positioning. If they had named, so Highway 96 is D, B, C, D, E, F, all of them make their way up. Highway 96 is actually County Road G. Legally, it's County Road G, if you can envision that, the one that runs to the west of town, the west of 61. But they've called it lots of things, I guess I shouldn't say that. If you were to truly have County Road H, it would, with the 1 mile increments, it would be 9th Street and White Bear Parkway, right? No? What is it? Otter Lake? No. No, sorry. Oh, the Stewart. Well, no, but that's H2. Yeah, but
1 mile that would have been, but because H is brought all the way across,
Okay, it's not worth doing. So
This is exactly half a mile.
Right in the middle. Okay.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a cedar or an orchard type.
Yeah, to offset the. So H2 runs, and then it, of course, runs you back into the lake itself, which takes us to Bald Eagle Island. And we've already seen that it had, Smith and Oak Island, and other names. The island itself is interesting because it was actually owned by the county. Basically, it was county land. There's some murmurings of legal ownership prior to that, but nothing that we can lock down. And so up until 1904, it was essentially public parkish property, and residents around Bald Eagle in the early years used it that way. They would canoe out there, or they would take the rowboat out there and picnic and do whatever. And then in 1904, it was purchased by a group of investors, much like Manitou Island in White Bear Lake, purchased by a group of investors who created the Bald Eagle Island Association. They maintained ownership in it until 1920, but they didn't really do anything, which is kind of weird. I mean, they just kept it that way. During their time as owners, it was used by by a man, kind of an interesting story. There was a writer for the St. Paul Dispatch who would do a boys' camp out at the island somehow. I don't know how he promoted it, but he would take boys out there, and they would, and usually underprivileged, sometimes kids who had gotten in trouble, and they would come out here, and they would have to create their own structure, if you will. So they would have to create their own government on it. They'd stay on the island for a couple of weeks, and they had to create their own, who was in charge and how does this work, and do all of these things. It was called, and it was during that time, it was called Boys City Island. It's an interesting piece that I wish we could dig out a little more on, because it sounds kind of intriguing, but it only lasted for 2 summers. So I don't know why that was the case, but for whatever reason, it's certainly been something that's been documented from the beginning. These take us back to, it was the original surveyor's notes, and they actually were revisiting things. This was approved finally in 1854, that it was actually, those were the true measurements for the island and the true location for the island. And you can see here how it was platted out into lots, interesting lots, but I'm not sure how you'd move about on there, but platted out in lots. But again, nothing ever happened in that regard. And still today, it is one large parcel, which of course is challenging to access unless you have a boat or a hovercraft, or the ice is frozen, or all of the things to get you back and forth, and kind of interesting. So, and that brings us to the very end.